Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
That was not an imagination in Indian policymakers' head that, China might attack. There were actually threats made, and Indian policymakers approached the Johnson administration saying, what are we going to do? And the Johnson administration, being busy with many things, such as Vietnam, said that we don't know. So this is also a moment where India, as a non-aligned country, is also not getting help from the superpower, especially the superpower in this case, who should be concerned about a Chinese nuclear blackmail.
You've got these three countries sitting next to each other with territorial disputes, with possibilities of crisis of all kinds, but which don't have a nuclear dialogue going on with each other to address each other's misperceptions, to understand each other's doctrine, and to see what kind of a capability trajectory they seem to be on.
In today's episode, we are joined by two of the world's leading experts on India's nuclear history and its current policies, who will walk us through the historical motivations of the Indian nuclear weapons program, how it has interacted with its regional rivals over time, what the current concerns are about nuclear risk, and what hope there is for arms control and confidence-building measures in the broader region.
My name is Jayita Sarkar. I am a professor at the University of Glasgow in the UK. And currently, I'm at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., where I'm with the Nuclear Policy Program, and I'm on a British Academy Fellowship. It's one of the policy fellowships for UK-based academics to engage in policy work related to their expertise. India's nuclear program is a very old one in the sense that it began in the 1940s. What I argue in my book, Plowshares and Swords, published by Cornell in 2022, is that it began around the time India became independent. In fact, a few years prior, because the main actors of India's nuclear program, such as Homi Bhabha, Vikram Sarabhai, the politically significant individuals such as future Prime Minister Nehru, very proactively thought about the role of nuclear fission, nuclear technologies, what a nuclear program could do for a future independent India. There were two drivers of India's nuclear program. One is freedom of action, which some other scholars have called strategic autonomy, but I call it freedom of action because it functions inside the country by insulating the program from other institutions and other actors, but also outside the country in terms of maintaining India's autonomy. So freedom of action characterizes India's nuclear program. But what I also find based on my research is that geopolitics, especially India's anxiety with respect to China and its close proximity to Pakistan being an important driver of the nuclear program since at least the 1960s. But the program began before. So I wouldn't characterize that China's first nuclear test led to India's nuclear program, which has been dual use from the very onset, even today. But the 1960s definitely gave an impetus to the geopolitical drivers for India's nuclear program. And that had to do with the only war with China, 1962, where India lost territory to China. And then 1964, when China conducted its first of many nuclear weapon tests.
I am Manpreet Sethi. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi, a national security think tank. And also I am a senior research advisor at the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. I finished my PhD in 1997 and joined India's only think tank at that time, which was the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Then in 1998, just a year after I had joined this think tank, India tested its nuclear weapons. I have for the last 26 years now, pretty much coinciding with India's nuclear journey, I have also been working on nuclear issues since then. To explain how India went nuclear, even though we tested our nuclear weapons in 1998 and then India declared itself as a nuclear armed state, the journey of India's nuclear program actually started much earlier. It was just within 1 year of India's independence. We got independence in 1947, and in 1948, India had set up Atomic Energy Commission. Dr. Homi Bhabha, who was chairing this commission and who really is known as the father of India's nuclear program, he teamed up with Prime Minister Nehru, who also had a very scientific bent of mind. And the idea that both of them had was that India, just having emerged from colonization, and given that Dr. Bhabha had the experience of interacting with the international community working on atomic energy issues, he wanted to get India to start off on this pioneering path right away. This Atomic Energy Commission was set up. And while the idea at that time was that they wanted to progress India on the peaceful uses of nuclear technology, and India did gain from the Atoms for Peace program that President Eisenhower in the US had floated in the early 1950s, the realization that nuclear weapons was a dimension that was important was not lost on either Bhabha or on Prime Minister Nehru. In fact, in 1945, the nuclear weapons were used. And Mahatma Gandhi, who was amongst the foremost leaders of India in leading it towards independence, went absolutely quiet. He didn't say anything about the nuclear weapon for 6 months because he was the one who was taking India on the non-violent path to independence. And for him not to mention something which was as violent as the use of a nuclear weapon was strange. But later on, he said that he was worried that the nuclear weapon could have been used to deny India its independence. The relevance or the value of the weapon was not lost on Indians. Therefore, even though it started with the approach that we wanted to do peaceful uses of nuclear technology, the strategic value of this technology was also very well understood. Then, when China conducted its nuclear test in 1964, and given that India and China had just fought a war in 1962, in which India had suffered a defeat from China, when China tested in 1964, the concern in India then was, what will this mean for our relationship, given that there are territorial disputes between China and India? As the literature goes, in August 1961, Nehru had asked Bhabha to take precautionary measures since the possibility of conflict was brewing at that time. And Bhabha had set up a small group of nuclear scientists to study the high pressure physics of nuclear explosion in January 1962. And they were exploring the ideas of conducting a peaceful nuclear explosion. Now, people often smirk when they hear that India conducted a peaceful nuclear explosion. But I do want to draw attention to the fact that PNEs were not uncommon in the 1960s and 70s. In fact, the US had a program called the Project Plowshare in 1957, which was undertaking tasks of PNEs, such as for deep geological mining, building tunnels, flattening mountains. The USSR too had a PNE program. And in fact, the International Atomic Energy Agency had discussed PNEs under the rubric of peaceful uses of nuclear technology in one of its general conferences in the late 1960s. So when India conducted this test, it was very much aware that there is a strategic dimension, but that there is a peaceful aspect of this explosion that it was coming up with. Now, the PNE was conducted by India in 1974. But before that, another war with Pakistan had already taken place in 1965. Also, before 1974, two other prime ministers of India, after the death of Prime Minister Nehru, had tried to reach out to the US, UK, and even USSR to get nuclear guarantees. But these were denied to India. As the security situation unfolded, India found it necessary over a period of time to move towards nuclear weapons. And if you calculate the period between 1974 and 1998, it is a good 25 years. So India sat on the fence for 25 years, largely trying to secure its national security through international security mechanisms. So its idea that nuclear disarmament will be able to take care of the China threat through instruments such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, also the CTBT that came into the picture later. India was always trying to push them as disarmament instruments, and India was party to the negotiations when these two treaties were negotiated. But unfortunately, both of them evolved as non-proliferation instruments rather than disarmament pushing ideas. As a result of that, when India felt that its national security concerns could not be addressed by these international mechanisms, and the noose of that non-proliferation went on tightening for India, it finally then went in for the nuclear test in 1998. That's in a nutshell how the security concerns and the non-proliferation concerns, which were not addressing India's security issue, is what finally opened up India's mind on actually testing nuclear weapons in 1998. It's in 1971 that India and Pakistan fought a war. And in this episode, India faced nuclear coercion when, in support of Pakistan, the US actually sent USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal, which was seen in India as a way of trying to coerce it to stop this conflict while it was still in favor of Pakistan. And then, just after this finished, Pakistan in 1972 decided to go in for nuclear weapons. There is this very famous episode where then Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto invited the Pakistani nuclear scientists and engineers and urged them to build the nuclear weapon. In fact, he is noted several times to have said that Pakistan will eat grass if necessary, but build the nuclear weapons. So India then was aware that Pakistan had set itself off on this journey in 1972. As I mentioned earlier, India had done a PNE in 1974, but it held back from weaponizing that capability in the hope that international instruments would take care of both China at one end and Pakistan's search for nuclear weapons at that moment in time. But by the late 1980s, it was already cleared through Indian intelligence inputs that Pakistan had acquired nuclear weapons. In fact, there is an interview to an Indian journalist by Mr. A.Q. Khan, who is known as the father of Pakistan's nuclear bomb, in which he said that they had the nuclear weapons. And then India started facing an uptick in insurgency in the state of Jammu and Kashmir from 1989 onwards. So, in the Indian mind, there was a connection between Pakistan having acquired nuclear weapons and therefore having built for itself an immunity that they felt they could use to carry on with insurgency or cross-border terrorism in Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. That linkage then again became very prominent for India in wanting to take its own decision on what to do with its nuclear capability. So the threat from Pakistan's nuclear weapon and the possibility of that subjecting India to nuclear coercion or blackmail was very strongly felt in India when it ultimately went in for nuclear weapons in 1998. Besides this, there was a collusion that was going on between China and Pakistan. There are several American scholars who have said that if there was no Chinese help to the Pakistani nuclear weapons program, there would not be a Pakistani nuclear weapons program. They did get help in terms of technology, fissile material, even design of a nuclear weapon. And all of this is well documented today through archival research and several publications. So the possibility of collusion between China and Pakistan was another threat factor that India then took into consideration when it finally decided to test in 1998.
Professor Sarkar shares the results of her research on the regional dimension of Indian nuclear decision-making.
Based on the political science literature, one would say that Pakistan has always been the most important geopolitical driver for India's nuclear weapons program. I argue in my book that it is predominantly China. It's not like Pakistan is insignificant. Obviously not. The first war between India and another country was with Pakistan in 1947. As India was becoming independent, that was the first war. And there have been several wars since. I do emphasize in my book, and that is also my position, is that Pakistan has been an important country in terms of India's nuclear program, but its geopolitical significance as a threat has been inflated and expanded because of Pakistan's proximity to China. Because if you think about conventional capacity of India and Pakistan, India is conventionally stronger. But because Pakistan's close relationship with China very early on, so there was an agreement, other people have written about, like Rudra Chaudhary and others, that this proximity between Pakistan and China on the geopolitical realm really affected how India saw the two adversarial neighbors on its two sides. Pakistan, even though conventionally weaker, has a very strong ally that has nuclear weapons after 1964, that is China, and China just being conventionally stronger than India. So I think the influence of India-Pakistan rivalry on India's nuclear program during the time period of my book, 1940s to 1980s, cannot be treated separately from the very important China factor. And if we think about nuclear programs, they're national programs, but they're also global at the same time. Whether these are partnerships of the country per se, that India getting technologies from other countries, but also the non-proliferation regime, right? And how the United States perceive the potential of India's nuclear program vis-a-vis other countries. There was a lot of anxiety within the US administrations, Kennedy and Johnson, specifically about what a Chinese nuclear weapon test would mean for India. It's not a new argument that I'm making that China is very important. But within the political science literature of South Asia and South Asia policy experts who often tend to focus on the present moment, where Pakistan is definitely very important, its nuclear weapons program makes it just as significant, because it's a question of parity through nuclear weapons, just as significant as another country. We tend to forget what it looked like before 1998 when both countries had nuclear weapons, right? So India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons in May 1998. That's a point of parity, and then questions about strategic stability and all of that we know about. But we go back in the past, the time that I'm talking about, the India-Pakistan dimension or dyad cannot be separated from the China factor before Pakistan got nuclear weapons. And I show in the book how 1962 war I already mentioned, that is the India-China war. 47 India-Pakistan I mentioned, but what is important is 1965 war. It's between India and Pakistan. But people still think, wait, that's not a very important war because it ended in ceasefire. There was a fight here and there, and that was okay. But the point is, it was during the 65 war between India and Pakistan that China threatened to open a second front of the war in around Sikkim, which is the Siliguri corridor called the Chicken Snack. And that was not an imagination in Indian policymakers' head that, China might attack. There were actually threats made. And Indian policymakers approached the Johnson administration saying, what are we going to do? And the Johnson administration, being busy with many things, such as Vietnam, said that we don't know. This is also a moment where India, as a non-aligned country, is also not getting help from the superpower, especially the superpower in this case, who should be concerned about a Chinese nuclear blackmail. So the 1965 war sealed this aspect of that India-Pakistan dyad is intrinsically related to the geopolitical adversarial relationship between India and China in a very conventional territorial sense. And then the 71 war, where Pakistan actually lost territory, that is, East Pakistan became a new country, Bangladesh. It was a 13-day military intervention by India that is considered to be a victory, and it was a military victory. At the same time, led to this anxiety that what are we going to do about these borderlands of Sikkim and the Northeast that still has significant amount of insurgencies against the Indian nation state and various kinds of fragmented belonging to Eastern Asia and sometimes China, right? There is also this aspect of how to code, if you will, of warfare, in the sense when there is an actual war, there is a beginning and an end, and the outcome is victory. But it still leads to incredible amount of geopolitical anxiety in the minds of policymakers of the victorious side, which is the 71 war. And once again, it doesn't make any sense unless we combine India, Pakistan with China. What is also interesting in India's nuclear program, like most nuclear programs, is a national nuclear program, obviously, but then no nuclear program is insulated and national. These are all global projects. And so there is a lot of partnerships that are involved. Also, in the case of Pakistan, and I have dabbled quite a lot in the Pakistani programs to make sure I know enough to connect it with India's nuclear program. What is interesting in the Pakistani case is that after the 1971 war, which was a military victory for India, but was a very clear loss for Pakistan. Not only was it a loss, it's a military loss, but also loss of territory. There is good enough evidence to argue that this is when Pakistan adopted a very clear, concerted effort to get nuclear weapons. However, 71 war was not the first time because Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 1965, the other war also said that we have to get our nuclear weapons. We're going to eat grass or do whatever. What is interesting and what I would like to talk a little bit more is about the actors, the partners in the case of Pakistan. Just like India's nuclear program, which was global partnerships, because it would have not been possible otherwise, right? Even the Manhattan Project is actually a global project, right? Without scientists from Europe in Los Alamos and other places, it would have not worked out. So there's always a global dimension to every nuclear program in the world. With respect to Pakistan, I find that after India's first nuclear explosion in May 1974, France becomes an important supplier, not permanently, for the moment. And why does this happen? Because the Energy Atomique, the French Atomic Energy Commission, had to renegotiate its contracts with India after India's nuclear test because there were claims that did the French help Indians, which they did not. But as in for the explosion, but there was some reputational costs that were involved. And the French had to renegotiate contracts with their Indian counterpart, the Department of Atomic Energy. Within the French nuclear establishment, there was this concern that the French Atomic Energy Commission is losing business. This is a moment when Pakistan asked for a plutonium reprocessing plant that would have allowed Pakistan to also get plutonium and potentially test a device if possible, just like India had done, because India had also explored a plutonium device. And the French had agreed and they signed the contract. And I fail to recall from my archives, having done this research a long time ago, with construction had started or not, but it was very close. And so it was only after US pressure bilaterally through Paris, Washington, but also multilaterally through the Nuclear Suppliers Group that Paris finally pulled out. This is a time when within Pakistan, there was also a shift away from plutonium pathway to a uranium enrichment pathway. This has to do with the two Khans, Munir Hamid Khan, who was adopting a plutonium pathway, and A.Q. Khan, who is quite well known within the non-proliferation circles that we inhabit through the A.Q. Khan network. He was in the Netherlands, he was in Urenco, he was a metallurgist, and he was able to get some of the Urenco technology with uranium enrichment and move to Pakistan. With that, he was welcomed and he was asked actually to contribute to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. It's fascinating how the 1970s is a moment of how the global proliferation pathways shift in this moment in South Asia, in the Pakistani case. And what is also notable is that this is from the late 70s, 80s onward. Because think about the Cold War and the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and how Pakistan becomes an important partner of the United States, leading to the US ignoring Pakistan's nuclear weapons development. This also allows Pakistan to get a new partner, a more willing partner that is not part of the NPT, not part of the NSG at that time, that is China. And so China becomes a nuclear weapons technology supplier, and that helps Pakistan with its uranium enrichment pathway. And so with Chinese nuclear weapons assistance, Pakistan is really able to get nuclear weapons development and really make progress on them.
We go back to Dr. Sethi.
India, China, and Pakistan inhabit what we geographically call Southern Asia. It's a rather unique situation in Southern Asia that you've got three countries that are geographically contiguous to each other, that have territorial disputes with each other, and that also have nuclear weapons. Another unique feature of these three countries here is that one nuclear armed state mounts cross-border terror on another nuclear armed state. And this then always raises the possibility of things getting out of hand, because any response then by India to Pakistan cross-border terror can lead up the escalation ladder from conventional conflict to nuclear conflict. Any conventional action that has taken place between India and Pakistan has been under the shadow of nuclear weapon. Meanwhile, the aspect of collusion in terms of help to Pakistani material capability, there is also the help that China offers during crisis to Pakistan. That is meant to then cow India down into not going further with what it is wanting to do with Pakistan. That's another complex situation that comes in with three players in this little geography that we have here. All three of the countries are practicing nuclear deterrence in different ways. You've got, for instance, Pakistan that talks about full spectrum deterrence and that believes that nuclear weapons are in a continuum from conventional to nuclear. So every time there is a conventional crisis between India and Pakistan, Pakistan likes to draw attention to its nuclear weapon and to suggest that any conventional response by India will take it up the escalation ladder. That Pakistan does not have the ability to fight a conventional conflict and therefore nuclear weapons will come into play. It's a strategy of brinksmanship that likes to project the use of a nuclear weapon in warfighting. Compared to that, India has a strategy of deterrence through nuclear weapons, through the idea of punishment that will come with nuclear weapons. India is not suggesting war fighting with nuclear weapons, but that any use of a nuclear weapon will result in retaliation that would inflict punishment on the other side. And then you've got China, which has not only a lead of 34 years compared to what India and Pakistan when they started their program, but it is also looking at the US as its primary point of reference of threat for building up its capability. China has in recent times begun to feel that it must have a certain kind of parity with the US, and therefore it is expanding its nuclear numbers. China's nuclear numbers had remained stagnant for almost 2 decades, but in the last decade or so, we are seeing an expansion of its nuclear numbers as well as addition of its nuclear capability. Now, while China says it's doing all of this in order to strengthen its deterrence vis-a-vis the US, there is a downstream impact that happens then on India and on Pakistan thereon. That's how this strategic chain conundrum in Southern Asia is different from nuclear weapons in any other part of the world. And then another very difficult aspect of this nuclear relationship here in Southern Asia is that there is no dialogue between these countries that's happening on the nuclear issue. Between India and Pakistan, there were some very forward looking nuclear CBMs, confidence building measures, that had been thought about, some of which are in place even today. In fact, when India and Pakistan first tested their nuclear weapons in 1998, the international community was extremely critical of the action that they had undertaken. And they kept talking about the possibility of the two countries blowing themselves up with nuclear weapons. South Asia was called the nuclear flashpoint. In order to address some of these concerns, within a year of testing their nuclear weapons, India and Pakistan had an outreach to one another and came up with a memorandum of understanding which brought together some very progressive CBMs. But unfortunately, the confidence between the two countries has not gained much. We are in a situation today where, for the last 5 years, the two countries have faced a highly difficult and tense political relationship. And there's no dialogue that's happening on the nuclear issue at the official level between these two countries. On the other hand, since China does not recognize India as a nuclear weapon state, still tells you that you are illegitimate because you don't subscribe to the NPT and you cannot be taken in as a nuclear weapon state, China is not willing to have any kind of a nuclear dialogue with India. You've got these three countries sitting next to each other with territorial disputes, with possibilities of crisis of all kinds, but which don't have a nuclear dialogue going on with each other to address each other's misperceptions, to understand each other's doctrine, and to see what kind of a capability trajectory they seem to be on.
Professor Sarkar reflects on Indian policy toward arms control.
I'm not entirely sure how much India would be an important actor in terms of arms control, which I like to define as reducing vertical proliferation, reducing stockpiles. I don't see any real opportunities for any of the countries in this triad, India, Pakistan, or China, in terms of arms control. I can only think about ways in which an inadvertent escalation can be prevented. And I think that's what is more important to talk about with respect to peace and stability in the South Asian subcontinent. There have been at least two instances of surgical strike by India on Pakistan. One was on the Pakistani side of Kashmir, and the other one was on Pakistani territory. And so these were acts that were not responded to from the Pakistani side. And I think that that is commendable. But I worry about what a future surgical strike might lead to. That is a conversation to be had in terms of what could topple the apple cart of nuclear deterrence in South Asia in the context of surgical strikes by India and the role of violent non-state actors coming from the Pakistani side. Because surgical strikes did not come out of nowhere. The military didn't just wake up and we're going to do surgical strikes today in Pakistan, because why not? That's not what happened. There were actual terrorists. The whole terrorism stuff goes back to the late 70s. This is, once again, not a new problem. It's just become a more pervasive problem because it's more frequent. This has also affected what Pakistani society looks like, because it's like a Frankenstein. If you nourish one, it's going to bite you at some point. So the terrorism also affects Pakistani society directly. It's also Pakistani government directly. But then what does that mean when you also have tactical nuclear weapons that are along the border on mobile trucks? This is what really keeps me up at night in a contemporary scenario, is less about arms control, because I do not see any reduction possible in terms of arms stockpiles that exist. I don't see vertical non-proliferation, because that's how I define arms control in my head. But I do worry about surgical strikes by India and the role of TAC nukes and the instability therein with respect to actual violent non-state actors present in Pakistan. During the Obama administration, there were visits by US policymakers to Pakistani nuclear weapons sites to reassure both Washington, D.C. and New Delhi that Pakistani nuclear weapons are safe. There is nuclear security that is being maintained, because nuclear security was a big deal for the Obama administration. If you remember, there were several NSS, nuclear security summits. None of that has happened during either the Trump first administration or the Biden administration. There are no talks that I'm aware of in terms of that. But the problem has not disappeared. We still worry about tactical nuclear weapons on the Pakistani side along the border, which are some of their mobile trucks. We still worry about violent non-state actors. And now we have India that is very comfortable with surgical strikes because it's done it twice already. So it's a very unstable situation that we are confronted with, that we need to talk about and maybe have some track 2 or 1.5 dialogues in the subcontinent.
Dr. Sethi concludes the episode with her take on the challenges of arms control for India today.
The future of arms control looks rather grim today at the global level. In fact, in all the conversations that we've had on this issue in various seminars and discussions, each one of us has been able to come up with the number of difficulties, the factors and the developments which are standing in the way of arms control. It's telling that for the last 2 decades, we've not seen any new arms control measure having been crafted between US, Russia, and all that existed has been falling by the wayside one by one. So we are in a very difficult situation of arms control at the global level. And I think that's largely coming from the fact that during the Cold War, there were only 2 players. So it was relatively easier for the 2 of them to engage in negotiations for arms control. Also, the 2 players had a certain parity at the conventional and the nuclear level. The numbers were roughly the same between US and USSR or Russia later. And therefore, it was easier for them to do the kind of arms control that they did, which was essentially bean counting and putting limits on numbers of where they wanted to go. That kind of an approach is no longer applicable to the new sets of nuclear dyads that have come into the picture. All of these are not at similar perches of capability. And therefore, it's becoming more and more difficult for them to then think about arms control. Another factor that's implicating on this is cross-domain linkages. During the Cold War, you had a clear distinction between conventional and nuclear delivery systems, capabilities, all of that. But in today's time, there are cross-domain linkages between highly accurate conventional capabilities being able to hit at nuclear sites. You've got hypersonic missiles, cyber disruption to nuclear command and control, the possibility of space being disrupted and implicating on nuclear deterrence. All of this has added several layers of complexity to arms control. And even before the experience and the template of arms control from the global level, which is largely US, Russia, could have been taken in by some of the other dyads, that template has been lost. So therefore, arms control will have to be seen afresh. And I think the dyads that are existing, where the dyad is elongating into a strategic chain, as I mentioned in the case of Southern Asia, because it's the relationship between US, China, India, Pakistan that forms a kind of a chain. Arms control in just one of the dyads minus the others is going to be a problem. With Pakistan, India has the trust problem or the confidence problem that they will live by the commitments. And just as I'm sure Pakistan must be facing the same thing from India because the trust deficit is on both sides. And with China, we've got this attitude problem that we don't accept you as a nuclear weapon state. So then how do you get a dialogue on arms control going in this domain? I think India started out with the understanding that arms control was something only for US, USSR, Russia, that arms control was essentially technology denial, that arms control was rationalization of the numbers. So they had gone to 50, 60,000 nuclear weapons. They realized they don't need so much. So they started cutting down and reduce their numbers. That was the first kind of thinking that India had on arms control. Today, I think the understanding is that arms control does serve your national security purpose because it brings a certain amount of stability and it brings predictability of the adversary's behavior. But unfortunately, the possibilities of doing that arms control with our neighbors at this moment in time looks extremely difficult. In any case, I don't think it will be arms control of the kind that we saw between US and Russia. It'll probably have to be more norms-based behavior, restraints that we can bring into actions and behavior. Fortunately, India, China, Pakistan, as of now, keep their nuclear weapons in a demated state. If we could have some kind of an agreement that formalizes this in some form, that would be one kind of arms control. If we could, for instance, have agreements amongst the three of us to say no attack, no cyber attack on nuclear command and control, that could be one kind of arms control. Fortunately, between India and China, both of us have a very similar doctrinal approach to nuclear weapons. So no first use is something that both India and China follow and have declared as part of their doctrines. Even though this is non-verifiable, there is a fair amount of understanding of why NFU makes for a good strategy. There is a certain confidence level that is there between India and China that is not between India and Pakistan because Pakistan does not accept no first use. But really, I think all of us are struggling with what could be the arms control that could populate the global space and then have some kind of an impact also at the regional level. So not a very promising scenario at this moment in time. I don't know whether we are waiting for a Cuban Missile Crisis moment before we begin to realize the value of having some kind of strategic stability and predictability in the nuclear domain.
Thank you for listening, and to our guests and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.